Well, this week, the New York Times got a big scoop about an internal White House dispute over giving up documents to special counsel Robert Mueller. The scoop itself was not such a surprise, but how reporter Ken Vogel got it was. Two prominent White House attorneys were having lunch at a popular D.C. restaurant last week when Times political reporter Ken Vogel sat near them at an outside table.
Cobb is obviously very easy to recognize with that trademark bushy handlebar mustache. And so, I'm talking to my source, and my source gets up to leave, and I say, you know what, I'm just going to hang out here for a little bit.
And hang around he did, listening to a conversation between lawyers Ty Cobb and John Dowd, discussing how to handle a document request by special counsel Robert Mueller.
They proceeded to discuss some of the, the most sensitive of this sensitive area. In a way that was very easily audible to me. The Times disclosed how they got the scoop, and virtually no one complained. Even Breitbart News called the lawyers incompetent for discussing the matter in public. But then Vogel went one step further. In a first-person account of how he got the story, he called overhearing an unappreciated journalistic tool, and went on to pat himself on the back by reprinting a note from the Washington Post saying, "It is every Washington reporter's dream to sit down at a restaurant, overhear secret stuff, and get a scoop." It's puzzling that they would be so indiscreet.
And puzzling you were so smug about it.
As I may be with many of these.
I was reading the obituary of the great New Yorker writer today, Lillian Ross, died at the age of 99, I think, yesterday. And she said the key to being a good reporter is never making yourself the story. And I have no problem with the way Ken Vogel got this story. I didn't like the way he behaved in the aftermath, like, oh, look at me, and wasn't I clever? And it's like, it was a good hit. He had a great story, got real information, legitimately, but I thought he turned the whole thing on himself.
But don't we oftentimes say we needed to know more about how this was, how did this come down? What's the transparency?
Well, he did a note.
Right, but I think that I like this because it was kind of walking you through, this is how we came to this decision. It was lawyered up. Editors looked, talked about it. And I think kind of giving the backstory, I think readers and viewers enjoy that. And I'd rather know more and even have him tell me in his own words than hear somebody else talk about it. The one thing I did like, I do think it's a lost art. Reporters sometimes, especially younger reporters, they like to go online and look around for stuff or just sit back in their offices and work the phones. But I remember when I first got into the business that I took a crash course on reading lips because when I was in a courtroom, I wanted to be able to pick out some little things. And I also was trying to figure out if I could learn to read upside down so you could read notes in a public place. So there are all these little tricks that we used to use, and we've gotten away from it.
A little tiny bit of self-referential backstory goes an awfully long way. And they dealt with how he got this information. They dealt with it in the article itself. They dealt with it in the special piece he wrote for the paper. They dealt with it in their podcast, The Daily. He talked about it on CNN, and there may be other things I'm not missing.
No, a couple of different
points.
I thought
you're just luxuriating too much, in my opinion.
Well, it's not the New Yorker in the 1950s anymore.
True.
It's all about building your brand, his and the Times. And I would imagine that some people at the Times were a little bit taken aback that the Washington Post initially got a much better story out of this than the Times did just by reporting on what the Times did. So I'm sure editors at the Times said, hey, we want a piece of that. Why don't you write about what happened? And we saw what happened after that. This is journalism in 2017. I have no problem with it.
Well, I think that because it was so unusual and some of the details make it so interesting that he took the photo. I'm thinking, how did he take the photo without them realizing there being, photo? And I love the piece about other New York Times reporters coming by trying to talk to him as they would. Yeah. And he's like, get away from me, get away from me, I'm listening. So it was interesting to know. Did he beat it in the ground? Possibly. But it's such that's never happening again, ever. Right. So it's just so interesting.
Is it worth floating the possibility that if he had not gone public with this and kept his MO under wraps and gone back to the same restaurant, that he might have gotten more good information in a week or two that now he's not going to get?
That seems so random.
That I'm not sure. There was also speculation that the whole thing was a setup. that those two knew who he was.
Yeah.
And I thought that
No,
was
but what gets me about that, and that why they were so engrossed in their conversation, anybody would recognize Maggie Haberman, and she was one of the people that came by to
Right,
talk,
right.
Yeah,
and they were so engrossed, so they were really not clued in to how loud they were talking.
And how could they not have ever heard that that restaurant is referred to as the New York Times' cafeteria?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.